he was in the best shape, the best condition of his life. The 80 season came around. Probably 3 or 4 games into the season, he had a crushed ankle. He was medevaced down to Cedars-Sinai for multiple more surgeries. Why am I telling you all this? But the reason I'm telling you all this is because I want you to understand who my man was and some of the things that he went through for the love of the game. Because to Jeff, it wasn't a business. To Jeff, it was his life. And that was his gift and his purpose. In 1981, he worked again, came back very strong, went to mini camp. The July of 81, he ended up passing his physical. And the only problem that they wanted him to do at that point in time was to waive his ankle and his back. Now, in order to come back to the Raiders the year before, he signed a waiver that said, if my back gets injured again, oh well. Well, this was the first time in his life that he decided that it was too much for him and that the game was over. And he called me on the phone, and I said, what's going on? He said, well, for the first time in my life, I'm afraid to go on the field. And I said, well, maybe it's time to come home. But I can't make that decision for you. Only you can. The next day, the garage door came up, and it was the last day, the last time that he would ever play professional football. It was also the last time that he would ever have a job, be able to work, because he was already physically disabled from football. So what happens in the aftermath? The impact on the health of players and families. Well, as I told you, I've already kind of described a lot of his injuries. And to know Jeff was infectious, 6'6", 290 when he played. When he walked into a room, it was like John Matuzak walking into a room. For all you younger people who don't know who that was, he also was a very powerful Oakland Raider lineman. His smile was infectious. He had one of the biggest hearts of anybody you would ever want to meet. So with injuries, we didn't know what to do after. We had no support. At that time, the NFL had no medical. And we didn't really know what to do. Both of us were what I call now being lost in transition. And with injuries came a lot of depression. And depression so much that there were times where Jeff thought the only way that he could support me was suicide. At that point in time, I'd gotten a job that took me a couple of days every week out of my area. I had 4 offices that I worked out of doing insurance replacement vehicles. And with that manic depression, the Players Association did give him a psychiatrist in Oakland that he would go see, until he realized that the psychiatrist in Oakland really wasn't even into sports, hadn't really understood the game, and could not understand what was happening and why he was so depressed. Jeff always wanted to be able to support our family. He always wanted to start a family. We had no family at that time, and 4 months after he left football, he surprised me with a wedding in Reno that I didn't know I was getting married. But the beauty of what he was doing on one side was priceless. On the other side, he didn't know what he was going to do. And what happens once you start having depression, we had a lot of financial difficulties, because even though a lineman back then was only making $80,000 a year before taxes, I was not making $80,000 a year before taxes, I can tell you that. And when you're in the state of California, you've got the state, you've got the federal withholding. So we ended up losing everything to do with any type of a possibility of a traumatic brain injury. So I'm going to go fast forward a little bit, and then I'm going to regress a little bit back. In 2005, Jeff and I separated. We were married in 1981. In 2005, we separated after 25 years. His behavior problems his anger management, his verbal abuse, putting holes in walls. Never hit me personally, wanted to, but would hit other things. And I had to learn also how to deal with him in that respect, because the one thing that I did not want to do was provoke him when he was in that moment. And then later, a lot of times he would forget that he had been in the moment, or he started having memory problems. And that escalated into all of the other 4 things that we just talked about. More manic depression. But the one thing that he did greater than anybody else was to stay in what I call staying in denial. He stayed in denial about it. Because when he walked out the front door, we wanted him to have dignity, we wanted him to have integrity in the community that we lived in. That was all he had. And that meant everything to him. But behind closed doors, when the shoulder pads and the helmets come off, and the family is lost in transition, and I had nobody to talk to, because we were in a little community, I couldn't go to somebody and tell them what was really happening behind closed doors. And the psychiatrist couldn't help him anymore. He started refusing to playbook. I think they have computers now. But when you had to give up that playbook, that was your life. That was who you were. Jeff played 7 years in the pros, but he played a total of 18 years of football. 18 years. He was an All-American in basketball, football, and track. And that's what he lived and breathed for. Why? Because that was his gift. That was his talent. That was what God had wanted him to become. And that's what he did in the best capacity that he could possibly do it. And the thing that hurt the most when he left football was he said, Brandi, they always said they take care of their own. They always told us that. They forgot to mention the things that went on in the locker room with Toradol, with lidocaine, with the Vicodin, with anything that they could use to get them back on the field. And at that point, you know what? None of that mattered anymore, because he was a broken man. And we had to help him get back to become a whole man again. And I didn't know what to do. So when we separated, I had tried to get Jeff to write The Flip Side of Glory for 8 years. It was too emotional for him. The name came from a Modesto Bee reporter that wrote an article about him, and it was called The Flip Side of Glory. And I thought, wow, if we ever write a book, that will be the name of the book. But it was too emotional for him. And when we separated, I had the courage to start writing and write the book. And it wasn't a book about bashing my husband. It was about a book about love, acceptance, and hope. And about never giving up on what your determination and finding out who you are in life and moving forward with it. But the one thing I didn't understand at that time, my man needed to go into his man cave and grieve. Because most family members don't understand what the player has gone through. If you're a girlfriend or a spouse and maybe you've come in the end of his career, you have no idea what it took to be that 1.6% of the elite athletes of the world and the discipline that it took to get there. When you look at over 1 million high school players every year, and what are the odds of them actually making it to the pros in the end? The odds are very minute. The odds of them even being scouted are about maybe 350 will be scouted. So by the time you end up trying to get to the pros, it may or may not happen. But the discipline that it took you to play, whether you played in high school or only college and never made it to the pros, is the same thing. And that's why we're expanding it now into high school and college athletes as well. Because this is the area where the family unit really needs to come together. Leigh was talking about it earlier, about the family connection and the education that it takes to put that family unit together. And if the family's over here and they're looking at their kid to go to the pros for all the wrong reasons, there's a big problem. And that kid's going to have a problem, and the family unit is going to have a problem and probably dissipate. So what we do together is we work one-on-one We work with groups. This was Boo Williams I met at an NFL regional conference we had in Tampa. Boo had tried to commit suicide. He played for New Orleans. He and I met in a workshop, and he just kind of he glued me, you know, he just followed me everywhere. He said, can we talk? We need to talk, and I got some people I want to introduce you to. And at that time, he introduced me to the Crosby Center, and I would fly out to San Diego and work with groups of former players. And the one thing that we learned in all of this is that with the NFL alumni chapters, with the NFL Players Association chapters that they have in the different cities, this is so vital to help with your recovery, because you are actually being able to come together with your buds. It doesn't mean that you played together. These guys had never played together. But by the time they were there for 6 weeks and they left, their lives had changed. And this is something that we have seen. I've seen it personally, and I am so excited to be able to talk to you about it today, because change can happen. Then what we do is we go into a group, and that's where I take the family unit. And we go back to the basics. It's called Football 101. This is a football. Because the key to the family is the education, and it's to stick together. It's developing and continuing to have the family engagement so that the whole team can come together and put a new playbook together. And then the thing that's most important is the aftercare. The aftercare is where you get to hit on those highs and lows. Jeff and I are partner with Pro Athletes Transition, but there's days where both of them still call me and they just need somebody to talk to, or they're having a bad day, or the pain has overtaken him that day and he can't do anything. But he also knows how to work with you to help get your medical records, get your benefit books. In 2015, I met Bennett Amalu. This was Bennett and I in 2015 in Tampa, Florida. He was just doing a junket for his book, Concussion. But I met him in 2010 at an NFL Veterans Conference I was speaking at. In 2009, I had met Dr. Ann McKee and Dr. Robert Stern of Boston University. And now I'm going to digress a little bit and how I got involved in all of this and how the Lord took me to make the changes that I've made today. I was writing the manuscript for the flip side. In 2007 of May, I was house sitting my girlfriend's house. Don't have HBO at my house, couldn't afford it. Channel surfing. Come across an HBO Real Sports special with a young man by the name of Chris Nowinski, who was talking about a book that he'd written called Head Games. And as Chris described, traumatic brain injuries, concussions, every single one of them was my husband, Jeff. And I got this knot in my stomach and I said, God, if I'm supposed to get involved in this, the question to me was, could this have been the demise of my marriage? Or was it prescription drug addiction with physical injuries that took his behavior pattern that way? I had to know. And Jeff and I had remained friends. In fact, we were remaining friends so much we thought we were getting back together, but he somehow had a bigger memory loss in California, and a few days before I watched the HBO Real Sports special, I got my divorce papers in the mail. So I didn't understand what was happening. When I talked to him, he didn't remember signing the papers. So I knew that we really needed to find out more. And I Googled this young man, and 2 days later I'm watching Joe D. that Jeff played for Buffalo, Tampa, and the Raiders, as I mentioned, and Joe D. played with Jeff at Buffalo, and Dick talking about the congressional hearings. And when I talked to Chris that afternoon, he said, you need to come, you need to testify, you need to call Linda Sanchez's office, you need to tell your story. You need to tell people what goes on. And I said, people don't know what goes on behind closed doors when the shoulder pads and the helmets come off. And the family unit becomes lost. And the reason I'm stressing this today, and I know we have some young athletes in here, I'm not trying to say it in a bad way, but I also want to help the family unit to whatever level you're at, whether you're an elite athlete or a former athlete, that this, or you're a professor, or you're a coach, or you're looking to maybe help other people and mentor them. This is just so vital. And at that point in time, when I got up there, I had my first aha moment. I walked into the Washington Press Club with the DICA press conference and my mind was blown. You see, when I wrote The Flip Side of Glory, I thought Jeff and I were the only ones who were having these problems. I did not realize, till I walked in the door, that there were hundreds of us having the same kind of problems. I fought 16 years to get my husband's disability. Too much to go into, you can read it in the book. But we went through a lot of trials and tribulations, and it was difficult being the sole support of my family. But Jeff was the love of my life, and I would do anything for him. And we have a beautiful son. He's 31 years old, just got married last year, and we have a baby on the way. At the press conference, everything changed, and I went back and rewrote the whole book because it wasn't the Jeff and Brandi story anymore. It was about all these families that were hurting. And on the way out of the airport, HBO called and said, "Hey, do you have any other wives that might want to do an interview?" Yeah. I just met a bunch. I just held hands and cried with a bunch of women for 3 days. Yeah, I got a few. And we did our HBO interview. I rewrote the book, and the first edition, I'm in my third edition now, came out in 2008. All of a sudden, I had families contacting me from Europe, Canada, and the United States. Wives, girlfriends, and players, or family members. A mother contacted me and said, "I just saw your HBO interview. I just read your book. Oh my God, you're telling my story. You're talking about my life." And that's when I knew that support groups were going to be the answer for us. Not only just for the players, but for the wives and families, to integrate, to help each other grow, to listen to each other vent, to listen to each other's problems, and have some place to go. And that's how I ended up forming Pro Athletes Transition. I'd already been doing it for 8 years, and last year I talked to Jeff Herrard, and he played 11 years in the league, 10 years with the Indianapolis Colts, and he said, yeah, and he can help, he mentors the guys, I work with the families, and then we come back together and integrate. And it's been some of the most rewarding work I've ever done in my life. We don't turn anybody away for help. We do it by phone, Skype, or in person. Individual, groups, or workshops. And that's what we're going to continue to do until my last breath, so that I can honor my husband. Some player resources, and one of the things that I wanted to stress at the end here, players, wives, and family members, if you have a member who has played in the NFL or any other professional sport, you need to read the benefit books. It was extremely emotional for my husband to even look at them, much less read them, or sometimes not even be able to comprehend them. You need to learn about your resources. I'm just listing a few here today. You need to get copies of all of your medical records from every team that you played for, and you need to get them to, if you have an attorney, if you're working with workman's comp, or you're working with the concussion settlement. Most everybody is already involved in that. But if you're doing a workman's comp situation, you need to actually see what was written in your medical records. And it's very important that when you give them over to somebody that you make copies of them, what you can qualify for now. When Jeff had degenerative disc disease, they've taken that category out, and I think it's because so many of the players had degenerative disc disease. I can't see the rest over there, but the one thing I want you to understand is that we're here for you. We want to be able to guide and strengthen you in any way that we can, even if it's just to pick up the phone and say, I just need somebody to talk to. And I want to thank Reggie, and I want to thank everybody for coming out today and being a part of this. I mean, like you said, we have some much bigger movers and shakers than me. But I want to thank you so much for having me today. God bless.